This is the Leica SL2-S. It is Leica's probably most affordable, full-frame, professional-grade camera. And honestly, if you just look at it, it is one of the most refined, futuristic sort of looking, but also classic-looking cameras out there. It's incredibly minimal in its design, but also has like a really good grip, a lot of things to love about it, but it definitely lacks some of the modern conveniences that many other cameras on this table have. So today I'm going to talk about the SL2-S, the SL2 system, Leica's whole SL series, and after using the Lumix S5 II series, seeing kind of where Leica might go in the future with this camera, things I'd like to see in a future SL3, and where this camera still shines in comparison to its more modern counterparts. Now, this video isn't sponsored, but if you like how the images are made, you can check out my presets and LUTs in the description down below. And I would like to say a huge thank you to Leica for sending this out for a couple weeks for me to use and check out. And so if you wouldn't mind leaving this video a like if you find it helpful and subscribing to the channel, that would be great. So as you can see here, I have a Fujifilm camera, I have a Lumix camera, I have this Leica camera, I have Sony cameras, I've used Nikon cameras and Canon cameras as well. I've used Hasselblad cameras. I have a pretty good grasp of what the market has out there as someone that has the opportunity to review a lot of these cameras and use a lot of gear. And I will absolutely say that there's kind of like some sort of graph between when a camera or piece of equipment feels almost like an instrument and when it feels like a tool. So the reason that I've always loved the Leicas and especially the M's is they feel more like an instrument. It feels like you're more a part of the process. It feels just more artistic and all of those kind of things because you are forced to be part of the process a little bit more. And the thing that I love now about these Sony cameras is the fact that the tech in them is just absolutely incredible. It kind of takes a little bit of that artistry away from it, but you're getting just like the end result out of this thing is absolutely incredible. But it's taking less of my personal, internal, mental energy to use. And that can be a great thing because especially for something like weddings, I can use that internal energy to go towards other things that are happening in a wedding day, like how people are feeling or how I can help a client transition between a different part of the day, or if I can look for better lighting. There's a lot of things where having something like this allows me the mental space to, go for it. I will say though, there's something about having not a struggle with the camera, but having less of the camera doing the work that forces that bit of creativity into your work. It's one of the reasons why I love using prime lenses. It allows me to have a couple different perspectives, but I'm not using every single little tool in my toolbox. I have to use my legs and my height and things like that to really be the differentiating factor instead of just zooming in and out. So those different things really just kind of help force creativity. And I think it honestly can make you a better artist. It can get you better photos at times if you have the time to work through that kind of stuff. Now, sort of for the sake of these comparisons, you can see just by checking this out that the Leica is just so much more refined. You have this single little LCD screen on the top here. And one of the things that I really have loved about the A7R5, the A7 IV, is that they removed a lot of the little numbers and things like that on the camera. So I'm not forced to use this particular thing as like a exposure compensation or ISO or whatever. I love that they've kind of minimalized that a little bit, but you can see on the Leica here, none of the buttons, none of the dials, none of those things say anything. It is just a very refined, very clean setup. And especially with something like the Lumix camera with all of its different bit rates and codecs and things, as well as just plethora of things you can find in a Sony menu. I think one of the things that I've always loved about the Leica stuff is it's just so minimal. You have less options, sure. And yes, at times that makes it more difficult to make images, but the fact that it's just so mellow and just minimal and all those things is something that I really, really love. You can especially see it here on the back as well. I mean, the Sony has just so many custom buttons. The Lumix does as well. And then you have just these basic buttons here on the Leica. You have one little joystick here and another custom button. and that's it. There's just not a lot to it. For the most part, that is really, really fantastic. And again, is something that I love as someone that can customize things, but I don't use all of the different buttons that is on the Sony camera at all. Now, one of the things I will say about any future Leica SL3 or anything is I would really love to have some sort of dial up here. I'm so used to on the M's being able to control all three aspects of the exposure triangle. And it's something that I legitimately do love about a lot of the Fujifilm cameras, and even about the Sony cameras here, is that almost all of their cameras have aperture rings, but they also have the front dials here. So the ability to easily adjust your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed without having to hit any sort of secondary buttons is kind of like a necessity to me at this point. And so I'm really hoping that with this singular knob here and then the one on the back, that maybe Leica can add a front dial here so that you can have all three things. Oftentimes, the way I have this set up on my Sony cameras is that I have ISO on the outer one, I have shutter speed on the top one here, and then on the front, if the lens doesn't have some sort of aperture ring, I usually use the aperture ring if I can, just because I love that tactile feel. And on all of my M cameras and stuff, and all of my film cameras, they all have the aperture ring as well. But if it doesn't, I still have this front dial. So definitely something that, while I, again, love the minimalism of the SL setup, and ergonomically, it's almost perfect, I definitely would really, really appreciate having one more thing there. And now, one of the things you'll see is that my Sony camera keeps falling over, and that's because I have a base plate on here to extend the grip out to be able to feel a little bit better in there. And if you look at it, adding the grip actually brings the Sony camera to almost exactly the same height as the Leica SL2-S. And so while it doesn't have the super ergonomic like finger cutouts and things like that does, it's a really, really clean setup, but the grip is so deep and does have indents for your middle and ring finger to kind of go in there. It does feel bulky, but with these smaller lenses like the new Summicrons and then all of these Lumix lenses, it really is fairly minimal because it's just so big and deep. It doesn't feel as large and cumbersome as it could, mainly just because the ergonomics are so good. And speaking of which, it just feels really, really classic. I love they have made the reporter version as well as the new silver version of this just looks so, so good. It's very reminiscent of an old Leica R series, or for me, I've used the Nikon F2 for a long time. Just has a really classic SLR style of feel to it. And then obviously the viewfinder on here, while not as high resolution as the A7R5 here, it's just so clear, and the way that Leica sets up all of their UI stuff, it's just really intuitive and feels, again, refined. If I could use a word to feel with this camera and most Leica stuff, it's just a refined experience. I think the two cameras companies that do the best of this right now are Hasselblad and Leica. They just feel like you're using a good like Apple product almost. Everything just feels really well made. All of the interfaces are so much cleaner, and part of that is just you're not worrying about all of those intricate little settings. I mean, I'm using like a monitor right here, and I can see so many different things on my Sony cameras that are great to know, but there's something about having a really, really minimal setup here that just works really, really well. I also love that there are these two buttons on the front of the camera. I use one of these when I'm using manual focus lenses to just punch in really quick. I have found that despite the Sony viewfinder here being a higher resolution, I've actually found this to be easier to manual focus lenses on. And there's just something about, I don't know if it's the actual size of the viewfinder or the magnification or whatever it is. I should actually look that up. But the experience of using this, you can still see that it's a lower resolution, but I definitely feel like it's just a better experience overall using this viewfinder. And I think especially for people that have any sort of M lenses or want to adapt lenses, that's why you see so many people out there using the SL2-S and the SL2 with their Leica glass, obviously because I think Leica has actually considered the fact that people are probably going to use these with their lenses as well. Now, let's get into my biggest gripe about this camera when I reviewed it 2 years ago, and that was the autofocus. I've been spoiled by using the Canon R series. Obviously, the Sony has always just been nuts for how good their autofocus is, but now having used the S5 II for a while now, I can say that the focus on these Lumix cameras with their new phase detect autofocus is really, really good. It's not all the way way to where Canon and Nikon are for tracking stuff, at least for now, at least how I use it. I've actually sent a few emails to people at Lumix to try to see if I should change my settings or anything like that. But how I set things up, it just isn't as sticky. But that being said, it's still a lot faster and stickier than these cameras. And it's the main reason why, while I was kind of trying to figure out where I was going to go between Sony and Leica for my autofocus digital stuff, one of the things that really held me back on this is for the way that I want to use an autofocus camera with weddings and people moving and tracking people dancing and things like that. There were just a few times where this camera didn't fully get what I was doing. It didn't fully capture the moment. It just didn't fully focus on the thing I needed it to focus on. And knowing that I would have nailed those shots on a Sony camera or a Canon camera was the reason why ultimately I didn't want to spend more money to get less performance in the autofocus arena there. Now, for portraits and for architecture and for all those other things, for a lot of commercial work, you don't need that incredibly snappy autofocus like you are going to get in a Sony camera. But like I said, there was just a few times where I was trying to track with this camera that it just didn't do so. I did find it to be fairly similar, probably not as bad as I remembered it being after using this camera for a little while, but it was definitely a few times where it's hunting, it's thinking it's in focus when it's not. I would just say tracking autofocus just isn't the name of the game for this camera at this point, but I'm hoping that the future SL3 series will be. So overall, this is still a fantastic camera, and I've seen some good deals out there. So if you are considering picking up this camera and you don't need really, really, really snappy and sticky autofocus, it's still an amazing camera. It gives you an amazing experience. It's definitely not like using an M camera necessarily or a film camera. You're not getting that pure of an experience, but it does feel more, I don't know, like you're part of the image making process than using something like a Sony. From its ergonomic design to just the interface and the menu systems, the viewfinder, all that stuff just makes this one of my favorite cameras to use. And if they can improve a few of the things that I mentioned in this video, I'm not saying I'll buy one, but it would be very, very tempting for me for sure, especially considering the experience you get out of it. So thanks so much for watching. Thank you to Leica for lending me this. I obviously have no idea what they're doing with their SL series, but I've given them feedback multiple times in the past on what I'm hoping to see from that series, and figured I'd repeat it here just because I think it's really interesting, and especially having used the S5 II for a while and then coming back to using this, I feel like I had even better perspective on that whole thing. So if you want to see my original video on the SL2 and the SL2-S, check it out up here. If you want to see my video on the S5 II, you can check that here, and I will see you all in the next one.